a real pleasure for me to start the process of the debate itself by introducing our guest speaker, Trudy Van Wyk. Trudy previously worked for the Department of Education in South Africa, an organisation I've worked very closely with over the past couple of years as well. She worked there as an ICT policy support and development. She now works for the Commonwealth of Learning, which is an organisation, an intergovernmental organisation, set up by the Commonwealth Heads of Government. It's about development and sharing of open learning, distance education, knowledge, resources and technologies. Trudy is going to pick up on the two previous debates. The first one came to the very broad conclusion that traditional schooling is really no longer relevant, and we have to make it more relevant. The second one, I guess, in summarising hugely, came to the conclusion that schooling systems are difficult and slow to engage with. Change is difficult and change is slow. So I think that's the starting point for Trudy's talk. So I'm going to hand over, with no more ado, to Trudy and let her do her introductory talk.
My first question I want to ask is, whose responsibility is learning? Is it the school's responsibility? Is it the parents' responsibility? Is it the community's responsibility? And I want to take a situation where we start off by birth and we go through the schooling right through to even after university. And we look at who is responsible, who's primarily responsible for learning. And if we want to be honest with ourselves, the first person who's responsible for the learning of a child is the parent. And we so many times take the parent out of the equation if we talk about learning. But then secondly, I want to say learning is a team sport. You can't have learning as an individual alone. But learning is a team sport, learning in a group, socializing. Then the community and the importance of the community, and the community can be formal and informal community. And we have to focus also not only on the pedagogy on the other side, but firstly also that the content that is there for the teacher is the right content and that is understood by the teacher. There's for me a very important element that we're adding at the moment, and that is technology, because technology is adding value to the content system as well as the pedagogy system. And the knowledge of technologies that supporting teaching and how to use them in terms of information management and information literacy, but also how do I use technologies efficiently and effectively in a classroom. If it's got 30 computers, if it's got 30 mobile phones, if it's got one computer or one mobile phone. And that is the range. We're not talking only of computers, but we're talking of relevant and appropriate technology. We have to give the teacher a voice, and not a voice to complain or a voice to say what he wants to say, but a voice that's acknowledged, a voice to collaborate and give also the opportunities to collaborate, to communicate, to contribute, and also the incentive to do that. And I'm specifically talking about incentives and not about salaries, because that is a very debate on its own. But I think it's the most important for us is to acknowledge the teacher and also to give him or her a stake in his own work and let him be the professional that he is supposed to be. Government produced a lot of content, but then it is closed by copyright. And what we are trying to do is to promote that government release public-funded learning materials as open education resources that teachers can use, reuse, and repurpose those resources. Do we try to turn education systems around by making schooling relevant, or do we go outside the schooling system and focus on innovative projects and initiatives for smaller groups of learners? And those are for me the two extremes, is where learning is taking place in a classroom, in a structured environment, and then on the other hand, as a community of learners and a smaller group outside the classroom. And can we make learning more relevant by making schooling more relevant? And those are, for me, the two questions that's up for debate. Thank you.
Somebody has to know how to solve differential equations to get that next rocket ship into space or whatever. And if we only made it relevant to the current interests of a 9-year-old, and we didn't help steer the path towards the needs of society in the broadest sense, we might lose everything. So that's why I think this triple way of looking at it, the needs of the individual, the needs of the community locally and globally, but the wider needs of the economic growth, they've got to be merged together. Otherwise, we'll end up in 20 years' time with nobody able to solve a simultaneous equation anywhere on the planet. So this is what worries me about the word relevance. Sometimes is too refined to an individual's needs at that moment rather than the future needs.
We have to somehow break free from these constraints and enable young learners to, yes, definitely gain skills for the future. But I really fear that in many education systems in the world, those skills are not taught in schools.
One concern I have is that a lot of times when you have educators that are creating very dynamic learning communities with their students outside the classroom because they're not able to get that process formally accredited, that those teachers are actually penalized. So some of the most innovative teachers that are creating the most enriching, eye-opening, globally aware experiences for their students, like if it's not connected to those standards for their learning, those teachers end up being penalized and burnt out over time. So I definitely think that the question of whether or not we work within the system or outside, I think you can't really choose one or the other. There kind of has to be a hybrid, because if you're working outside the system too much, it's just benefiting a small group of students, and ultimately over the long term the teachers are penalized and the students also feel that maybe they're not getting what the education that they should be getting, and can create a lot of tension.
Entrepreneurship has to involve risk, and that has to involve failure. And all of our assessment systems seem to be encouraging success. So I would just love to share ideas around here. You know, how many of you can come up with a really good assessment system that gives higher marks for failure? And I think when we achieve that, we get really innovative and creative.
For example, prototypes. So come up with 5 ideas. It doesn't, like, there are ways to do it. Also, you could look at how many times you've tried something, like how many times have you been rejected, and like creativity and approach for asking for support. And by the way, I love the fact that you mentioned sort of community-based value. I meant that inherently, absolutely. But I think you're right. I think that's the question to ask.
It's another way of thinking about when do you accumulate different aspects of who you are, and it involves redefining failure and success from a linear, let's build the high skyscraper of knowledge so that I'm a technocrat, to one which says you have this ability to do something that's creative. It's creative for you. It's what I call, and people have heard me say this before, heterarchical, not hierarchical.
I want to be clear about this divide between using technology to improve the delivery of existing content versus deciding that the technology underlies changes in content, and not just the technology, but other changes in society and changes in what one requires in life skills and in jobs. And I feel like sometimes these are a bit confused together, and we need to separate those. Sort of following on from Tim's point, in the end, you know, the content of the curriculum has to be relevant, and certainly in the things I'm involved in maths and related STEM subjects, that often isn't the case right now. Part of the reason that's not the case is because people haven't taken into account the changes in society that outside education that have occurred, which allows one to do very different things inside education.
We're talking about how much we value local communities all around the world. To put this into context, what Michelle is saying about urban-rural, you know, we've just become an urban planet. Some 50.1% of the population is urbanized, but 49% isn't. And Vietnam has just entered the industrial era in the sense that a majority of its people are now engaged in industrial economics. I've been to Fiji, where they had an 80% unemployment rate, and teachers there are hoping that some of their students will eventually become travel agents or get a job as a civil servant, but the rest of them will be working as farmers and, you know, just taking whatever local work they can get. And in that context, where we're moving from inner city London to Fiji,
everywhere we go in the world, if the British Army has been there before, we find that the classrooms look pretty much identical. And so making learning relevant, I'm afraid that it sometimes turns into how do I continue with the classroom model wherever I happen to be, anywhere in the world? Whereas we might actually say it's much more relevant if we tended to see entirely different designs showing themselves in different parts of the world.
When we learn in a context with today's reality. For example, technology, which is my main interest in education. I think if we don't include the technological aspect in education, the education today become less relevant because and the learning less relevant because the technology is a context and the reality which is covered almost all over the world, and the places where technology is not so spread, then they will become more and more challenged by the technology. Then, in my point of view, making learning relevant implies to include the realities of today's world. For example, environment is another aspect. It's not the same to learn without these global contexts. The education and the learning without these trends, this big context, makes learning less relevant. This is my main point for the discussion.
We do see some really interesting stuff going on in informal learning situations where people set up schools outside the normal system. We recently commissioned a paper, that we being Cisco, from Charlie Ledbetter, called Learning from the Extremes. And he came up with a really, really interesting model at the end of that document, and I really commend everyone to go and read it. But what he did is he went out and looked at these non-formal and informal education systems. And yet we still see, those lessons being picked up. We see things like Not School in the UK. We see these successes and the value for money and the return that we're getting on making education relevant. And what they're doing, and it picks up Jim's point, is they're taking kids who've dropped out of the school system and getting them back into learning and an interest in furthering themselves and getting them back into a system that might have failed them before by starting with their own interest and pursuing their own interest. And if they need to learn differential equations, then they will do. If they need to understand Latin, Michael Gove will be very happy, and they will do. So I think we need this focus on the individual within the remit of government's agendas, within the community needs. And it's back to Jim's point he made at the beginning, that we really need to start thinking about how you get children to learn more effectively, more quickly, better, so that they can live, work, learn and play in a global society, and yet add relevance to their own individual situation. And we need to look outside the school system to do that.
What Ron Clark does is he puts everything into the context of the learner's social background. But how can we expect, maybe Tara can remind me, I think UNESCO say that of the 60 million teachers on the planet, 13 million need at least 2 years training to get up to standard. We're 60 million years of training behind. This seems to be the massive challenge. We know that teachers are the key, but how can we help them make learning relevant if they can't even teach their own subject?
Maybe the whole division of labor is beginning to shift in a world where, because we're becoming better, we don't need so many people pulling barges and pushing bales. It's because we've got engines and hydraulics, and the same thing goes with behavior around schools. Maybe we don't need to be spending as much time training people to show up on time.
I'm not a very good musician, but at times in my life I've tried to learn an instrument. And when I'm doing that, I probably want to be taught alone. And I'm trying to develop a skill and a competence. And sometimes this takes place in school time, and As a maths teacher, I used to get fed up when the kids got withdrawn to go for their piano lesson, and sometimes it takes place at home. But that's definitely something which is all about competence. If you like music, you probably want to play with others. And so when Trudy was talking about the social aspect of doing things together, that's one aspect, the C for community there. So there's competence and community, and it's fun doing things together. And that seems to me that what is one of the things that's very lacking in schools I go to nowadays, certainly in this country. There's very little sense of fun and people doing things together within normal school times. There are exceptions. There are out-of-hours clubs, which take place sometimes now increasingly within hours. But that's the real problem, again, with the sort of formal curriculum PISA model. The third C is the competitive one. One aspect of education that's always been there is to get better qualifications so that you get the better jobs or whatever it is. So there's the grade system, and I want to become a grade 8 and bar and performer, and I want the job on the first clarinet of the London Symphony Orchestra, something way beyond my grasp as playing tenor sax like Stan Getz. So those are my 3 C's, competence, community, and competitiveness. And somehow the knack is to see if we can embrace all those in the school curriculum.
You know, the reason exams seem to be so important, one of the reasons is they're easy to assess relative to various other ways to assess people. And because you can put a number on them easily, it means that people like to put the number on, you know, because that way somehow they can compare it numerically with something else. So even though I'm a maths kind of guy, I don't like these very simplified numbers attached to things as a basis of comparison. And I think that's very damaging to many of these assessments, which in turn, I agree completely with the point earlier, that also damages what's in the curricula because that's being driven by the assessments that themselves are much too narrow.
We're back in the what you test is what you get. So if you say we want a wider curriculum and we want good exam results, but we're only going to count good exam results, you don't get a wider curriculum. It's simple. So you're never going to change and upskill teachers if it's all they need to be able to do is get good exam results in unchanging syllabuses.
Before the technology became that dominant, school systems was the only place where people go to really acquire knowledge. And what is happening today is that we all acquire knowledge inside and outside the standard school system.
Can I just make a plea that the relevance of the school system isn't necessarily the relevance for those out of school? If I remember correctly, there's statistics in 2007, 75 million children out of school. Yeah, there are a number of ways that we can use technologies to support informal learning. On the Escuela project in the Philippines, for example, other projects around the world. Can I just encourage us not to focus specifically on schools, but the informal education systems, programs, out of school youth, and the ways that our technologies can support them through mobile devices, through all sorts of initiatives. That has to be given, to me, even more prominence, because let's face it, those in school, however bad the school system is, however untrained the teachers, they're the privileged ones. Those out of school haven't even got that.
There's a lot of duality. There's teacher, student, top down, bottom up, supply, demand. You can do this all by yourself or collaborate. We should change the test. You should ace the test however you want. The non-formal, the formal, the killer app, or no bandwidth at all. And I keep on thinking of a specific issue in Sichuan and the earthquake. And here you have failure. The buildings collapsed. You have a very specific context here. You have teachers and students who died. You have a real community crisis. You have a policy issue that people have to address. Do we give people equipment and curriculum and open educational resources, or how do you reconstruct that society? The specific contextual areas. People learned in the context in which we were working that they could ace the test because we couldn't change it, but we had to do STEM through science education and earthquake safety, and it was where you test and fail at shake tables and springs, and you work back and forth with this, you use technology. The key in all of it was the fact failure and success sort of left the picture. What ended up happening was that the community was engaged, the non-formal community, because people were working with things that were directly related to their lives, but they had to do with the highest level of safety, structural and non-structural hazards. So it was content and pedagogy. It was top-down and bottom-up. And I think the key is that the teacher in the middle of that had the tools inside her or him rather than things done for him or her, and we're able to navigate that space. And I think that's important in all these debates.
It seems to me that whatever, well, in the Western developed world, and I would hope in the developing world, but I don't know it well enough, most parents and most communities would like their youngsters to think for themselves and act for others. After all, civilization isn't going to hold together wherever you are unless that happens. And clearly, therefore, the curriculum that we have on offer that's being determined by governments, whether they're in the West or the developing world, aren't always relevant to that thinking for yourself and acting for others, but kind of reduce it to something that, and Conrad's gone on about it, and is right, things that are eminently easily measurable, whether you're tackling the issue of a child having kind of mastered some basic skills at 7, 8, 9, 10, or whether it's when youngsters are 15 or 16. Now, therefore, I think to make education relevant, if we go back to what Trudy was asking us at the beginning, she I think ended up by asking us whether we thought it lay, and I'm now answering from the developed world point of view, whether it lay within the schooling system or groups doing other things. And we've heard discussions about how when the school doesn't work, there are alternatives which can work and do work well. I would have thought, therefore, what we ought to be doing at the school level, intervening at the school level, is putting on them an obligation not merely to meet PISA-type answers, but also answers that would show that youngsters have had the sort of experiences that we would all want for our own children, and will vary according to whether you're in the developed world or the developing world. But most people locally could agree that in our area it would be visits to theatres, it would be taking part in public performances, it would be residentials, it would be intensive, and it will be different wherever we are in the world. Now, until governments do that, then I'm with Conrad and others. Teachers will march relentlessly to the tune on which they're being assessed.
The elephant in the room, which has only really been mentioned by Jennifer, is employment, or put another way, unemployment. There's a book coming out. I'm doing a speech in Dublin on Friday, and I got hold of it, by a man called Jim Clifton, entitled The Coming Jobs War. Pretty depressing read, but it's a very important book. The passage that I'm using, he says, the primary will of the world is no longer about peace or freedom or even democracy. It's not about having a family, and it's neither about God nor about owning a home or even land. The will of the world is first and foremost to have a good job. He estimates, backed by, I think, PwC, that by 2020, there will be 1.35 billion good jobs and 3 billion people looking for them. He defines a good job instead as being a wage, but from an employer of roughly 30 hours a week's work. So this is not a very ambitious notion of a good job, but that is the reality against which we're educating vast numbers of young people. I think to forget that is difficult. At the beginning, Trudy talked about who has responsibility, and I actually got as far as parent, child, state, and the educators themselves are what I wrote down. Now, the interesting thing is when it comes to jobs and competition, their interests, the interests of that group, are indivisible, because if one fails, they all fail. And I think that for us to not acknowledge the sheer brutality of what that competition for jobs is going to look like is possibly also to fail as educators. We tend to be the soft, fuzzy, cuddly end of the equation, and rightly so. We look for other values. But the truth is, our kids, the kids we're educating at the moment, are going to face a very, very brutal world that's tied itself to a form of capitalism that it doesn't know how to unhook itself from. How we help them with that, I have no idea. But Trudy, when we get back to you, copyright I'd love you to raise. The issue of responsibility and comparative responsibilities would be interesting, and relevance. there's a book, I'm sure some of you know this, Cathy Davidson's book. It's called Now You See It. It's actually a fantastic book. She talks about, rightly, the unrealized digital impact of digital learning. And this is an area, again, where practically we could begin to, I think, make some moves. Jim makes immense number of moves in his work with Promethean. But in the developed world, let's stay with the developed world for a second, we're certainly not doing the job we could do, and therefore we're not releasing the potential of the kids we could release. And Sean, very early on, last point I'll make, you mentioned the fact, and rightly I think, that each country, in a sense, was possibly looking for a different set of skills and different set of educational outcomes. I flew in this morning from West Cork, where we're suffering a good deal from recession, global recession. Our assets tend to be agricultural and horticultural, and yet our ability to teach agriculture and horticulture, the ability to optimize those assets is very, very limited. And I just leave this question hanging. How would you do in PISA scores if we in West Cork were doing a sensational job, retraining farmers, bringing young people back to the land and teach them to grow things? Would we fail, or would we be enormously successful as a region that dug itself out of a ship?
I'd like to take just a moment to thank everyone who's contributed, not just across the telepresence, Tarek on WebEx and other people on WebEx, but also lots of people out there